The war between Ukraine and Russia has reached a stalemate in the Donbass region. While the Ukrainian armed forces remained in a defensive position, especially in this region at the beginning of the war, it has started to carry out very active offensive operations since the last few months. The priority front line where Ukrainians are concentrated on in Donbass is the city of Bakhmut. Violent clashes have been going on here for more than 10 months. Although Bakhmut is said to have symbolic significance, there are critical connecting roads such as Kromov to the northwest of the city and Ivanovsky to the southwest. These supply routes also give Bakhmut strategic value because the city of Bakhmut has now formed a bridge between Luhansk and Donetsk. For this reason, both sides of the war are very keen to gain dominance of the city. The Ukrainian side has recently started to deploy its special forces to the field in order to seize Bakhmut, especially in the southern line of Bakhmut. There is a very special unit fighting for the Ukrainian army, trying to control an area almost as far as the city of Opyten. This unit is the 3rd Assault Brigade, also known as the Azov Regiment. This striking brigade has begun to complicate the work of the Russian forces in the southern line of Bakhmut. In recent days, the Azov Regiment, which supported the troops of the Ukrainian army in this region, actually took a much more active position after the Russians drove the Wagner forces back to the front line. This change of position of the Azov Regiment began to take effect in a short time. The legendary special force of the Ukrainian armed forces, the Azov Regiment, recently launched an incredible offensive operation in the southern direction of Bakhmut. Ukraine's legendary brigade reported that in the southern trenches of the city, they managed to repulse Russian forces at a length of 1,730 meters and a depth of 700 meters. As a result of this striking operation in the Bakhmut trenches, 23 Russian soldiers were killed and more than 40 injured. In addition, in the operation organized by the Azov Regiment, dozens of military equipment, including tanks belonging to the Russian army in Bakhmut, were destroyed after the capture of the Russian military equipment. The 3rd Assault Brigade also managed to capture a detachment of Russian soldiers during the attack on Russian positions in the city of Bakhmut. A dozen Russian soldiers from the so-called Stormzy units of the Russian 72nd Brigade were captured by the Azov Regiment. One of them was an ex-convict, and this person had participated in clashes for 3 days at the front near Bakhmut. Ukrainian sources reported that the captured person had an important duty and responsibility for the Russian army Stormzy. Assault divisions were formed by the Russian military command as part of certain Russian military units. The military command was working to strengthen the army assault groups, taking into account the experience of leading Wagner PMC assault groups. The principle of the establishment of such companies involved the recruitment of persons from the reformatory similar to the Wagner units. However, the Azov Regiment managed to inflict heavy damage on the military company network that the Russians wanted to establish on the territory of Ukraine by capturing the soldiers of the Stormzy assault companies. In other words, the operation mission was successfully completed by the soldiers of the 2nd Assault Battalion of the 3rd Brigade of Ukraine. Units of the Russian 72nd Brigade tried to retake lost positions but were unsuccessful. So after all this, what is the latest situation in Bakhmut, the stronghold of the war? While many of Kiev's claims on the battlefield remain unconfirmed, it is clear that Ukrainian forces have made minor gains north and south of Bakhmut in recent weeks, breaking the Russian defensive position in a key battle that began on May 6. Speaking during a visit to Ukrainian troops on the Eastern Front, General Skirsky claimed that Ukrainian forces continued to advance in the suburbs of Bakhmut and were close to tactically encircling the city. Also, Major Rodion Kudryasov, a commander in the Ukraine 3rd Assault Brigade, noted that the Ukrainians continued to make small but significant gains around Bakhmut. The Wagner Group still maintains its positions on the Bakhmut front lines, so Commander Prigozhin continues to keep his mercenaries in Bakhmut to snatch whatever he wants from the Russian administration at any time. Withdrawing forces from an active front is no simple task and may leave Russia vulnerable to attacks by Ukrainian troops high up on the outskirts of the city. Given the widely reported tensions between Wagner and Russia's military leadership and communication problems within Russian ranks, analysts say Ukraine will watch for cracks to be exploited on the battlefield. Even if Commander Prigozhin does not withdraw his fighters now, military analysts have noted that Russia will face difficulties in controlling Bakhmut, especially as Ukrainian forces are preparing a counterattack that could escalate clashes along other parts of the 600-mile-long front line. Russian forces will likely need additional reinforcements to hold the city of Bakhmut and its flanks at the expense of operations in other directions. For this reason, Russian President Vladimir Putin would be dependent on Wagner forces in every way. Even Ukrainians and British military intelligence reported that there was evidence that the Russian army had sent thousands of soldiers to the region. Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Sana Malyar said in a statement that the Ukrainian army continues to fight for dominant heights around the city while clearing areas of the city under Russian control. Considering all these explanations, the Ukrainians still claim that they have besieged at least part of the city. That is, the Ukrainian authorities report that they are putting pressure on the north and south of Bakhmut, causing some local retreats of the Russian forces there. It looks like the situation in Bakhmut will continue like this for a while because it is thought that Russia does not have much power to change the general course of the city at this moment. The Russians paid a heavy price for a counterattack that did not yield much gains at Bakhmut. This comes entirely from the way Russian forces fought in some parts of the city. The Russian army, like stormtroopers, are using more human wave-style attacks on Ukrainian positions. It is therefore probably inevitable that Russia will have to undertake another round of mobilization this year to replace losses. So why does Russia continue to insist on this issue despite having suffered so much damage in the war for Bakhmut? Russian President Vladimir Putin is actually aware of the answer to this question. Yes, Russian and Wagner losses in Bakhmut were almost unstoppable, but President Putin must have something to offer the Russian people and his soldiers against all these losses right now. This is why the Russian leader is so persistent in ordering his troops to seize Bakhmut. But President Putin's insistence seems to result in a very critical situation for Russia. The reason for this is thought to be the inability of the Russian army to increase its defense expenditures due to economic instability, and Ukraine, on the contrary, easily renewing its inventory with military aid. If things continue this way for the Russians, it seems likely that the Ukrainian army will first take full control of Bakhmut. If the Ukrainian forces can completely clear the Russian soldiers and Wagner combatants in Bakhmut, it may be the beginning of the end for the Moscow administration because Vladimir Putin believed strongly in the war in Bakhmut. The Russian leader even showed a lot of favor, as we mentioned, even to Wagner commander Yevgeny Prigozhin, just for the acquisition of the city of Bakhmut. But the current picture is not at all what Putin intended. The Ukrainians continue to gradually clean Bakhmut from the Russians, albeit with small steps every day. The heart of the Russia-Ukraine war continues to beat in the Crimea. Crimea, the pearl of the Black Sea, has strategic importance for both countries. For this reason, tension in the region is constantly rising. Vladimir Putin unjustly invaded Crimea in 2014, actually starting the Ukraine war 9 years ago. Now, while Vladimir Putin dreams of invading Ukraine, is he about to lose Crimea, which he annexed years ago. In Crimea, the Russian army was completely panicked, and the Kremlin seems to have started evacuating Russian civilians from the peninsula in case of a possible Ukrainian offensive. Let's take a look at the stunning developments regarding the evacuation of the Russians on the strategic peninsula. According to the latest and updated information, it has been revealed that the Russian administrations in Crimea have prepared evacuation plans for their employees. Russian authorities on the peninsula are making a list of workers and their families who are subject to priority evacuation. In fact, the General Staff of Ukraine states that escape plans have already been created and approved. In some cities, it was announced that such a plan was being prepared in the northern part of the peninsula, close to the Ukrainian mainland in the town of Krasno-Perekopsk. This was not the first instance of evacuations in Crimea. In the first days of March, we heard the news that Russian troops took their families from Perevolnoye in Crimea to Russia. It was like a bombshell in the news that the soldiers serving in the Russian forces were trying to smuggle their families out of Crimea by taking precautions against a possible Ukrainian attack. Ukraine's successes on the front lines in a series of drone operations against Crimea are among the most important factors that threaten the Russian presence in the peninsula. In addition, in the last month, the issue of Crimea and evacuation had occupied the agenda. In February, it was reported that the officers in Simferopol, which was under Russian occupation, were preparing to evacuate at the so-called state-owned enterprises of Simferopol. Officers were given to fill out questionnaires in which, in case of evacuation, the full name of the evacuee and the composition of the family were indicated as the reason for this evacuation. The Russian authorities highlighted the risk of earthquakes. However, we all know that it is not possible to predict earthquakes. The real fear of the Russians who use the excuse of an earthquake is the Ukrainian army advancing on the peninsula. It is clear that the authorities put forward the evacuation plan due to the threat of the Ukrainian troops to the Crimea. So what was the real reason that made the authorities in Crimea so uneasy? Let's look for an answer to this question together. Explosions in Melitopol, especially in the first days of this week, greatly disturbed the Russian presence in Crimea because Melitopol is a critical region controlling the land corridor between Mariupol and Crimea. In addition, the Ukrainian armed forces aim to cut the connection between the Crimea and the Russian army by blowing up Russian headquarters and positions with long-range or inside attacks. The struggle of the Ukrainian forces in Melitopol, known as the gateway to Crimea, does not end for a moment. We can easily see Kiev's determined stance on Crimea in the attacks on these front lines. Not only the explosions in Melitopol, but also the attacks that took place in the inner regions of Crimea worried the Russian authorities. Also this week, Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles made a show of strength in the skies of Crimea and managed to frighten Vladimir Putin. The last of these attacks occurred at around 16:20 local time in the airbase area in Gaverdysk in Crimea, which was temporarily occupied by Russia yesterday. Mysterious Ukrainian weapons struck and blew up the military airbase 240 kilometers from Russia's front line in Crimea. Local residents reported that explosions were heard and seen again in the temporarily occupied Crimea, this time in the area of the military airbase in the urban-type village of Gaverdysk in the Simferopol district. According to local reports, first, a few explosions were heard, then black smoke appeared above the airbase. According to the claims of Russian officials, Russian air defense systems hit the unmanned aerial vehicle. In addition, a large crater was allegedly found at the scene. The diameter of the crater is about 10 to 12 meters, and the depth is about 3.5 meters. The military air base in the village of Gaverdysk received another incurable wound with the attacks by the mysterious vehicles of Ukraine. In addition to the Gaverdysk attack, Sevastopol and Bakhchisaroy near Yalta hosted explosions in Bakhchisaroy. The engineering warehouse of the military unit of the 758th Logistics Center of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet and the warehouse of the 133rd Brigade of the NTO of the Russian Federation Black Sea Fleet were located. Ukrainian drones targeted these Russian ammunition depots. On the other hand, the Russian Ministry of Defense, which is uneasy about the frequent flying of Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles over the skies of Crimea, attracted all the attention with its statements. In his official statement, the Russian defense minister stated that Ukraine targeted the civilian infrastructure in Crimea. This statement made by Russia was denied by the Kiev authorities. However, it is an undeniable fact that there is an increasing activity in Crimea. The Ukrainian military frequently attacks minimum bases, airports, and ammunition depots in Crimea, sowing the seeds of fear in Vladimir Putin's heart. This move by Ukraine scares Russian officials in Crimea as well as Putin. Russian authorities, who want to be protected from Ukraine's attack on Crimea, find a solution to evacuate the city piece by piece. Do you think Ukraine can take back Crimea? Let's take a closer look at this possibility together. Once the jewel of the Russian Empire, the strategically important Black Sea region has a long history, including resistance to the Nazis in World War II and, more recently, annexation by Vladimir Putin in 2014. Also, two simple geographical facts deserve further attention when trying to understand Putin's objectives in this war. The dependence of Crimea on water resources from mainland Ukraine and the importance of the naval base in Sevastopol. One reason why Crimea is so important is that it is home to the natural harbor of Sevastopol, the only deep water port on Russia's Black Sea coast. The ports of Sochi and Novorossiysk are shallow and require ships to anchor in the open. Without Sevastopol, Russia would not have had a home for the Black Sea Fleet, which it used to project its power into the Mediterranean and start a war in Syria. On the other hand, Crimea is an arid peninsula that receives insufficient rainfall to meet the needs of its population of 2 million. After Russia's annexation in 2014, Ukraine dammed the canal 10 miles north of the Crimean border. Since then, Crimea has been drawing water from the now drying and polluted aquifer. Climate change has brought reduced rainfall and higher temperatures to the region, increasing the water deficit. 2 days after the February 24th invasion, Russia blew up the dam, restarting the flow of water into Crimea. In short, the status of Crimea is key to understanding Russia's war against Ukraine, as it is known in the first days of the war. President Vladimir Zelensky was cautious at first when he came to express his ambitions regarding this coastal region. But as the war continued and the Ukrainian troops gained more and more victories on the battlefield, the Kiev leader's stance became clearer. Crimea is Ukraine, and the Kiev armed forces will take it back if Zelensky's determined stance is supported by his Western friends. It is only a matter of time before Crimea falls into the hands of Ukraine as part of the overall effort for Ukraine to win, defeat the Russian forces, and force them to leave Crimea. Western allies have promised Ukraine tanks. Besides tanks, Ukraine will need long-range precision attack weapons such as long-range ATACMS missiles that can be fired from a truck-mounted HIMARS launcher to successfully drive Russia out of Crimea. As a result, Zelensky realized that the Crimean wound must now be cauterized. Failure to retake the peninsula would mean an ongoing threat to Ukraine's state identity and global security. The fact that Crimea is a concrete target may change the face of the war. With Ukraine's determination to retake Crimea and Russia's insistence that it will defend it, it may only be a matter of time before this conflict turns into a battlefield reality. There is a lot of news from the East. A huge conflict between different structures inside the Russian army caused the Russians to lose momentum in solidarity completely in order to claim that regular forces took Solidar. The Russian Ministry of Defense removed the Wagners from the front and deployed airborne forces to continue the storming. This was a huge mistake that allowed the Ukrainians to regroup and prepare all out of defensive positions. When it comes to the situation inside Solder, even though the Russians have not eliminated the threat of the supporting fire from Blahodotna and Polivka, they are still launching one wave of attacks after another due to the persistent crossfire. Storming the salt mines and seal station is extremely difficult, and the only thing the Russians have achieved so far is putting the approaches to the main Ukrainian positions in the gray zone. The most important thing is that the Ukrainians still control this powerful fortifications and do not allow the Russians to cross the railways. Yesterday I told you that the Russians shifted their focus to the southern flank of Soldau in order to undermine Ukrainian defense there and work their way up to Blahodotna and salt mines. Today, Ukrainian General Staff reported increased activity along the northern flank as well. Here the Russians launched an artillery preparation on Drozdovka and Vasily. Some sources also reported an attack, but it looks like it was just regular reconnaissance. When it comes to Krasnohora and Palace of Kahir, the Russians are assaulting the outskirts of these settlements. Yesterday I told you that they have been attacking them from the south, but today some unconfirmed reports suggested that there was another attempt to penetrate the Ukrainian defense in front. Given the lack of further reports, it was highly likely unsuccessful. The Russians likely expected the Ukrainians to focus on the southern direction and lose vigilance. But it looks like this assumption was wrong. According to a Russian source, the latest fights took place close to Paraskever, near the Bakhmutka River. This implies that the Russians are operating in the gardens, confirming my previous assessment of the possible axis of advance. As you probably noticed, the Russians lost their momentum. One of the biggest impediments to the Russian army turned out to be the Russian Ministry of Defense, because after most of Soledar had been captured by the Wagner forces, the Russian Ministry of Defense tried to hijack the operation from their own proxies to take full credit for the anticipated capture of the city. Two things happened. Firstly, the command structure has changed. Prior to the change, Surovikin was in charge of all operations in Ukraine, and Surovikin is considered to be a friend of the head of the Wagner forces, Prigozhin. This means that the Wagners had a lot of freedom and support for the last several months. Now the Russian Ministry of Defense appointed Gerasimov to be in charge of all operations in Ukraine, and Gerasimov is considered to be a friend of the Defense Ministry. Russian army consists of all out of separate semi-autonomous forces, such as regular forces, volunteer battalions, Donetsk People's Republic Forces, Luhansk People's Republic Forces, Chechen Republic Forces, and all out of private military companies, with the most famous one being the Wagner Group. As you can imagine, there is all out of internal conflicts as the head of every structure tries to expand its political influence and power. That is why they always blame others for any mistakes and claim any victories. Secondly, it is widely known that Bakhmut and Silidhara have been the area of responsibility of Wagner forces, and the Wagners are the ones who established almost full control of Solidarity. But once the Wagners started storming the last Ukrainian positions, the Russian Ministry of Defense hijacked the operation. They sent most Wagner units inside to clear the city, while they deployed airborne forces to conduct offensive actions in order to secure the credit. Prigozhin claimed that the Wagners established full control of Solidarity. The Russian Ministry of Defense denied his claims in the evening, and the next day claimed control over it themselves, despite Ukrainian presence in the western suburbs. The same happened in Krasnohrad and other regions around Soledar. The Wagners were largely substituted by airborne forces. This is very good news for the Ukrainians. Such developments work in the Ukrainians' favor because they motivated troops that achieved some victories. The troops that actually had been fighting here and know the terrain and situation were withdrawn. This gave the Ukrainians more time to regroup and fortify new positions. In fact, the Institute for the Study of War noted that the Ukrainians established fortified positions on the west side of the highway. Russian intelligence says that more units will reinforce this Lent already tomorrow. And if we look at the topographic map, we can see that the area to the west of this road is located on the highlands, boosting the Ukrainian tactical position tremendously. Lastly, the freezing days have ended and the ground will be soaked with wet snow, which means that Russian advances will be further complicated. Some Russian analysts already expressed their disdain at the fact that the Ukrainians were given enough time to stabilize the front line. That is why a lot of experts are predicting the shift to positional fights in this region. Overall, the internal politics of the Russian army undermined the whole Solidar operation and gave the Ukrainians time to regroup and establish multiple defense lines west of the city. The results are already visible as the Russians have not secured any gains in days. This is a perfect chance for the Ukrainians to regain the initiative and dictate the place of the next big battle.